He was the master of Europe, a military genius who rewrote the map. But one single decision would burn his empire to ash. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the largest army ever seen. 600,000 men marched under the French eagle. They were invincible on paper, a force of nature sweeping east. But the enemy was not an army, it was the huge land itself. His target was Russia, a vast and untamed empire of silence. He believed a quick victory would force the Tsar to surrender. But the Russians had a different plan. They did not fight, they simply retreated, pulling the French deeper into the void. As the French advanced, the summer heat became their first killer. Men collapsed from exhaustion before seeing any combat. Water sources dried up, and disease began to spread through the ranks. The supply lines stretched until they finally broke. Napoleon sought a decisive battle, a glorious victory to end the war, but the Russians vanished like ghosts into the mist. They burned their own villages, their own crops, and their own bridges. They left nothing for the invaders but scorched earth. The French army marched into a wasteland. Hunger began to gnaw at the soldiers. Horses died by the thousands on the road. Still, Napoleon pushed forward, blinded by his own legend. He believed that taking Moscow would end the war in an instant. Finally, the Russians turned to fight at Borodino. It was the deadliest day of the Napoleonic Wars, a true river of blood. Cannons roared for hours, shaking the earth itself. Tens of thousands of men died in a brutal clash of steel and courage. Napoleon won the field, but he did not destroy the Russian army. They retreated again, leaving him with a hollow victory. He marched on to Moscow, expecting a delegation of surrender. He expected the keys to the city and a peace treaty signed. Instead, he found a ghost city. The streets were empty. The houses were silent. The population had fled before he arrived. That night, the fires began. Small flames turned into an inferno. The Russians had set their own holy capital on total fire. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as Moscow burned to the ground. His prize was nothing but a pile of smoking black ash. He waited for a surrender that never came. For weeks he lingered in the ruins while the clock ticked toward disaster. Then the snow began to fall. The first flakes were gentle, but they signaled the arrival of Russia's deadliest guardian. General Winter had arrived. The temperature plummeted overnight. The French army, dressed in summer uniforms, was doomed. The retreat began, a long death march back to the west. The road they had come in on was now a frozen graveyard of horror. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. Men froze where they stood. Weapons fell from numb hands into the deep white snow. There was no food. Soldiers fought over horse meat and leather. Discipline collapsed as survival became the only instinct. The Cossacks appeared from the forests, striking like wolves. They harried the retreating columns without mercy. The Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a starving mob of ghosts, stumbling through the endless, blinding white. They reached the Berezina River, trapped between the ice and the enemy. It was a scene of chaotic panic and utter despair. Engineers stood in freezing water to build bridges, dying to save their emperor. The tragedy was a carnage of lost souls. Only a fraction of the men made it across. The rest were captured, killed, or swallowed by the frozen river's dark water. Napoleon left his army behind and raced back to Paris. He had to secure his throne before the news of the disaster broke. But the damage was done. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. The world saw that the emperor could actually bleed. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, only a few ragged thousands returned. The rest lay in the snow. It was not a battle that defeated him. It was hubris. It was the belief that he could conquer nature and geography itself. The enemies of France saw their chance. They formed a new coalition, united by the sight of the falling French giant. The empire that had taken years to build began to crack in months. The invasion of Russia was the beginning of the end. Napoleon would fight on, but his best soldiers were gone. The skeletons of the Grande Armée remained buried in the east. This campaign is a timeless lesson in the limits of power. Ambition, no matter how great, cannot overcome reality's laws. The snows of Russia melted, revealing the cost of one man's ego. Fields of bones stretched as far as the eye could see. History remembers Napoleon as a genius, but 1812 remembers him as a gambler who bet everything on one hand and lost it all. The one mistake was not a tactical error. It was ignoring the warning signs. It was believing he was greater than fate. Today, the road to Moscow is still marked by the graves of the fallen, a silent monument to the tragedy of blind ambition. Empires rise and fall, but the land remains. It endures the march of armies and the dreams of kings, indifferent to all. Napoleon lost his empire in the snow, proving that even the greatest leaders are subject to the brutal laws of the world. The lesson of 1812 echoes through time. Know your limits, for when you reach too far, the fall is always devastating. This was the end of the Grande Armée, and it was the moment history turned the page on the age of Napoleon Bonaparte.